Hi everybody, Dave here. Our CyberWire podcast team is taking a well-earned break for the holidays, but don't fret, we'll be back January 2nd with all new episodes of our show. In the meantime, we're running extended versions of some of our favorite interviews from 2019. Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to all of you. Stay with us. My guest today is Kevin Lancaster. He's the General Manager of Security Solutions at Kaseya and CEO of ID Agent. Kaseya provides IT management software solutions for organizations and MSPs, and ID Agent is a dark web credential exposure data monitoring platform. Back in 2015, Kevin Lancaster led the team responsible for restoring and protecting the identities of 4.2 million government employees in the aftermath of the OPM breach, one of the most damaging data breaches in U.S. history. But first, a message from our sponsors, McAfee. Ideas don't come for free. Budgets are begged for, long hours are required, the months, maybe even years of research, the sheer human effort of it all, the changes, the revisions, the reworks, the results. The adaptation, the innovation, the collaboration, all lead to the final moment when it pays off. And it's perfect, your company's work, as long as it's not compromised. From device to cloud, McAfee harnesses the power of 1 billion threat sensors to design security that moves beyond intelligence to insight. So you can move beyond optimizing security products to optimizing your security posture, and not just react to threats, but remediate threats that matter. Intelligence lets you respond to your environment. Insights empower you to change it. McAfee, the device-to-cloud cybersecurity company. To learn more, go to mcafee.com/insights. That's mcafee.com/insights. And we thank McAfee for sponsoring our show.
This was May-June timeframe of 2015. I was monitoring some of the bid opportunities on FedBizOps, so the federal bid board, if you will. And we'd spent a couple of years prior to that providing identity restoration, identity monitoring services to various federal, state, and local government agencies. But we saw this RFP come out. I had a really quick turn, essentially like a 36-hour turn on this RFP. And reading through it, it looked like something bad had happened. It was, I think, titled Privacy and Incident Response RFP. As it would turn out in the news, that OPM was indeed breached by a nation state. And so there were reported, or effectively upfront, 2 different breaches. One that impacted 4.2 million current and former government employees. That was the breach number 1. And the second dealt with a much larger population, 20 million plus individuals who have either been a government employee in some form or fashion, or maybe they were cited as a reference on a background investigation or background check for a government employee. So it had a much broader scope, that second incident. So we were hired to support the first incident, the current and former government employees of 4.2 million people.
Now, my recollection is at the time when this happened, I mean, this was really at the forefront of these large breaches. It certainly caught everyone's attention, not only for the size of it, but for the amount of information and the depth and nature of the information that was taken.
You're absolutely right. Prior to that, you had a handful of incidents that had made the news. I think there was Target, Anthem, and Heartland, a few of them. But this was the first, or based on the scope, it was the most massive, the most damaging to the personal identity. It wasn't just a credit card that could be deactivated or an email address and password, which is bad enough. The data that was extracted included personal health information. It had social security number, job positions, performance reviews. I mean, it had essentially a full dossier on a majority of these individuals. So this was a very damaging incident from that perspective.
And so how did your team approach this? Was something this large, How do you get your arms around it at the outset?
So when you have an incident, a breach, the first focus, the first goal is always, identify what happened, what was extracted, and then, normalize and secure, right? So you want to, really respond quickly and understand what happened. Unfortunately, secondarily, on the back end of that, you normally have these condensed windows when you're deploying some type of monitoring solution to support the victims. And so in this case, that RFP, as I mentioned, it was a really quick turn, 36, maybe 48 hours. By the time we had seen that RFP, I think we found it on a Friday morning and it was due by Saturday afternoon. So again, really quick turn. From our submission to contract award, I think it was maybe 72 hours or something like that, maybe that Monday or Tuesday night. So you're talking about very chaotic times, very condensed window. And so once you start down the process, you start on the contract, you start gathering the team, working on crisis communications. You're doing a lot of things in a very condensed amount of time. So we win the contract. We get to Tuesday of that following week, and we're starting to get our plan in place, starting to get call center spun up, 800 numbers. We thought we had another couple of days to really get our program in place before we really had to go public with what happened. Unfortunately, I guess there was a leak of the incident and hit the news about a day sooner than everybody anticipated. So it was a really interesting exercise in crisis communications trial by fire, just because the enormity of this. It wasn't like it made a single publication. I remember we were on a call prepping for the program implementation, and across the scroll on CNN, says massive data breach at OPM, and that's really when it gets real for everyone. So it's always chaotic when you're dealing with an incident, but something of that magnitude, it's obviously polarized. It's compounded by the fact it's the U.S. federal government, and it's going to make the news just about every corner of the globe. So there's always that period where it's really intense, and then you get into program launch, and you reserve 800 numbers and notifications for those that were impacted by the incident. But again, because of the enormity and how much speculation there was, the government, OPM, and others decided to release the call center 800 numbers. And so we went from really strong response times, maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes in the call center, to something like 3 hours, 4 hours.
Wow.
Because it just didn't go to a small publication. That number hit everywhere. It was on every website. It was, it was made very visible. So it's really interesting be involved in that process up front. Every incident they take shape or a life of their own. But in this particular case, again, because of the enormity of what had occurred, it was intense.
How long did it take you before you felt like you and your team were running at a reasonable pace, that you had things sort of under control, where we've established what's going on here, the systems are in place, and now we can continue doing the work we're doing, but we're not so much in a sort of a reactive, chaotic situation?
It took us probably 3 to 4 weeks to really normalize. Again, because it was so public, it was so visible. Then you had the Senate and the House, chiming in as well. It took us about 3 weeks to really get staffed up properly, because the 800 numbers were released, and we just had that deluge of responses. But there's some really good byproducts out of this. At the end of the day, right? I mean, it was chaotic, but often how you measure the success of an incident response, particularly when you're dealing with identities, is what the enrollment or the uptake is on the identity program. So if you look at like Anthem, for example, when they had that breach impacted 80 million people, from what I understand, they might have had a 1 or 2% enrollment into the identity monitoring services. And maybe industry average is probably 3 to 7%. But after the that quick storm that we had, we were actually running around 25%. So out of the 4.2 million individuals up front, we had 1.1 million people enroll, which by a program standard, that's hitting the ball out of the park. So we were able to recover and then get the program back to where it should be. And that's right around the time that we started having the ability to look at trending within that population. So for example, once we had right around 1 million people, we would look to see, all right, it's generally accepted that the data was extracted and it was taken by a nation state, and that stuff probably won't surface out on Tor or as people refer to the dark web or deep web. But if you ran the analysis on the individuals that had enrolled, we could point definitively to the fact that 76% of the people that enrolled in the identity monitoring program had already had their data out on the dark web, out on Tor, from other third-party data breaches. And so for us, that was one of these moments where it really highlighted how vulnerable organizations are, our government, private sector. So if it took one credential or one incident to expose what was exposed in the OPM incidents, we could point to the fact that out of that population, there's 800,000 or so additional email addresses, passwords, pieces of PII that are out there in that population. So using that as a sample set, if you overlay that over the 4.2 million people, you're talking about a couple million potential keys to our government networks. And so it turned from crisis to strong enrollment to, hey, look, I think we really found a really interesting challenge that the government has to overcome, and that's this volume of third-party data breaches and how it could be used to exploit our government agencies.
So what has changed since then? And since the fact that this breach happened establishes kind of a new normal, that the government experienced this. So from that point on, what functions differently? What sort of evolutions took place within the government now that it has to operate within that reality?
I think, they use those terms, watershed moment, all these terms to describe the enormity of this, but I think it was a great awakening. I think people understood that there's, these things that could happen, but, it turned that theoretical into reality, right? And so post-incident, you see NIST coming out with 800-171 to really start to look into the supply chain and see what they can do to affect security. You see today DoD putting out the maturity model, so the CMMC, essentially telling DoD contractors, if you want to do business with us, you have to be certified. Your security, maturity, and habits, have to be validated in order to do business with us. And I think that goes into effect at some point here in 2020. So I think for one, it brought, it shined a light on to really, something that was out there that people really couldn't get their minds around. And you're seeing organizations, agencies like NIST really taking the lead, in supply chain. And then, since then you have, Europe coming out with GDPR. You've got California coming out with CCPA, these privacy laws that are, geared, toward private sector. And now you have New York with the SHIELD Act that's set to drop here in March. And that even goes down, where California is looking toward, the large Facebooks, the 25 million in revenue and above, the data brokers. The New York Act actually brings it down to small business. So I think, overall, between FedGov and state and local, folks are starting to take this stuff, serious.
When a big breach happens, and I would say, for example, let's just say something in the private sector, a company accidentally suffers a data breach and a lot of information gets out. And I think it's fairly routine these days that they will offer credit monitoring to the folks who fell victim to the breach. And my sense is that there's a bit of eye rolling that happens with that people, it's sort of the horse has sort of left the barn, and thanks for providing us with the credit monitoring, but, how valuable is that? That's an area that you work in. That's an area of your expertise. I mean, what is the truth there? What is the value of that? Should we be rolling our eyes, or is that an effective way to protect ourselves?
Kind of goes along the line of, there's a term out there, breach fatigue. Right? You turn on the news and here's a breach. There's another breach. This one's more salacious than the last. So yeah, there is that element of, all right, it happens and it's just kind of the new norm, new reality. On the identity side, we do still work within that space, and I'll tell you that it's something that everybody should have. Everybody should be looking, not just for monitoring their credit and what have you, but you want to know what PII elements are actually out there. And so there are a number of options today on the identity and credit monitoring. There's free, there's paid, but it's one of these things where you should have something at minimum, because it might not catch everything, but if your social security number is being traded, if your, mother's maiden name, your driver's license, if all that information's out there, at minimum, you need, some type of awareness. And it's often after something bad happens to an individual where it's 3, 6, 9 months down the line when they have bills showing up in their name or, they have some form of exploit. A lot of these things could, at least be identified through some of these monitoring programs that are out there. They're not the end all be all. They're not going to catch everything, but it's, they're minimums these days. And unfortunately, that's, again, the reality that, of the environment that we have today.
Is this something that as a security professional at an organization, should this be something that I consider offering to my employees or even, for, key team members, even requiring it?
I think that there's legislation or IRS laws that were passed where employers can offer it basically as a deduction, I guess, or non-taxable fringe benefit. So certainly you're seeing a lot more employers doing that. But I think at minimum, employers or organizations, private sector, public sector, minimum, they should be looking at their own data. So for example, at Kaseya, right, we've got 40,000 organizations that we support. We've got customers that are using our dark web monitoring tool to understand what of their email addresses and passwords are out there, what are their potential vulnerability or exposure points out on the dark web. So a lot of this is just general awareness, right? It's just understanding what are the blind spots, because this is the new norm, the new reality. They're not the end all be all. They're not going to catch everything, but at minimum, like knowing, as I was saying, like knowing is half the battle, right? Mm-hmm. So, this is part of that new norm that we live in.
As we're recording this, we're coming up on 2020, and the OPM breach happened back in 2015. So I think it's sort of unique in that we have the ability to have that distance in the rearview mirror between now and when it happened. What are some of the take-homes for you now that you've had time to take it all in, to analyze what has happened in your own mind? When you look back on it, what are some of the lessons you take away from it?
I think just from the incident itself, the challenge with any large organization, any organization from that matter, right, is that it's becoming increasingly complex, right? And attacks are becoming increasingly sophisticated. But there are some minimums that OPM could have done. There's minimums that most organizations could do. And I listen to the show quite often, and I hear a lot of talk about multi-factor, two-factor. That is, today should be a bare minimum on any corporate system, any business system. Most of the large salacious breaches that you have out there, unless you're dealing with a very persistent, well-funded adversary, most of them could have been mitigated with layers, right? Adding in multi-factor to access your O365. So I think part of the takeaway is that maybe it was a funding challenge for OPM, FedGov in particular. There were bare minimums that they could have been doing 5 years ago. There are bare minimums that organizations could be doing today to mitigate 70, 80% of the attacks that they see on a daily basis. And so one of the disconcerting things in all this is that you still see statistics out there about 75, 80% of people still use the same or derivation of the same password, right? And the broader population, 4 or 5% of the broader population are using a password manager or some type of multi-factor or single sign-on in anything they sign into. So it just tells you that we've still have a long way to go to make these bare minimums standards. That is, I think, part of the positive byproducts out of some of these incidents. Looking at what NIST is coming out with, these frameworks and their statements on passwords and password usage and complexities. I think looking back, it's like, wow, that was 5 years ago. A lot of things have changed and a lot of things haven't changed. And so there's good and bad, I guess, in hindsight.
That's Kevin Lancaster from Kaseya and ID Agent. Our thanks to McAfee for sponsoring our program. Visit McAfee.com/insights and find out why McAfee is the device-to-cloud cybersecurity company. For everyone here at the CyberWire, I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.